So here's the list of representative heroes for today's lecture. We heard about St. Francis of Assisi last time, but I put his name up here just for the sake of reference. We'll see the big basilica at Assisi built in his honor at the outset. As St. Francis was the most important spiritual figure in Italy in the 13th century, the Emperor Frederick II was the most important political figure. He was known as Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, and was heavily involved in the world of civilized life as well as politics. He sponsored the work of some of the greatest musicians, artists, thinkers, and builders of his day, and Dante says Italian poetry began at his court. The Minnesinger, or German troubadour, Walter van der Vogelweide, can represent the music of Frederick's day, and it's with this fellow with the memorable name that it's usually said that the history of German music begins, and that's especially important because music will of course become, more than any other, the German art form. It's often said that Giovanni Pisano is the man with whom Renaissance sculpture really began, and Cimabue is the painter with whom Vasari begins his account of the history of Renaissance art. Giotto is the most important fellow we'll hear about in the arts today, however, and you should be prepared to like his work. There's hardly been a bad word said about him in 700 years. So this is the facade of the Basilica of St. Francis at Assisi again. As I was saying last time, Francis left instructions to the effect that his followers were to remain poor, not accumulate wealth from donations, not become capitalists. They were to use only abandoned churches and so on. But immediately after his death, Brother Elias, who became head of the order, began the building of this, one of the most impressive abbey churches anywhere. Elias was forced out by more conservative monks, but work on the abbey didn't stop with his departure. The basilica is now today sometimes called the earliest Gothic church in Italy, and may have been at least partly designed by German architects. But apart from the door and the rose window, its facade could have been taken from the plans for a warehouse, I think. The interior has more Gothic features, however, and even if Giotto's involvement is not universally accepted, it was decorated by most of the important painters of the late 13th and early 14th centuries, members of what we can think of as the first great generation of Italian painters. We'll go first into the crypt-like lower church, which has frescoes by Simone Martini, about whom more next week, and also some by his fellow Sienese Pietro Lorenzetti, brother of the more famous Ambrogio Lorenzetti, about whom we'll also hear more next week. To the left of the altar is the fresco by Cimabue of the Madonna enthroned with St. Francis standing by. We'll see it up close later. And to the left of that is the crucifixion attributed to Giotto. Other scenes from the life of Jesus attributed to him are above on the left. Lorenzetti is also given credit for the crucifixion on the right side of the altar. The nave of the upper church, the main church, is even more impressively painted and is attributed by most Italian scholars to Giotto, but by most non-Italians to an assortment of lesser painters. We saw some examples of the work here last time when I was using them to illustrate the life of St. Francis, which is the subject of the frescoes on the lower walls, and again we'll hear a lot more about Giotto as a painter later in this lecture. The series of frescoes higher up on the walls, which have the Old Testament as their subject, are less often attributed to Giotto, even in Italy. I mentioned last quarter that many scholars say that the key feature of the Gothic style is the ribbed vault, and both the lower and upper churches here have them, but that still doesn't make this church look much like Chartres Notre Dame in France. This kind of fresco decoration in a church nave of the 13th century is essentially unheard of north of the Alps, and is unusual even in Italy. In fact, as we'll see later, this church hardly has more in common with other examples of the Italian Gothic style, like the cathedrals of Siena and Orvieto, than it does with French examples. The upper church was badly damaged in an earthquake in 1997, as I'm sure you know, when much of the decoration at the entrance and at the crossing fell from the ceiling, but this damage has now been restored and the basilica has been reopened to the public. Luckily, no serious damage was done to the frescoes on the lower walls, and the lower church wasn't damaged at all. Now, St. Francis was the most important religious figure in Italy in the 13th century. The most important political figure was the Emperor Frederick II, known as Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. As many of you will remember from last quarter, the Holy Roman Empire is sometimes said to have come into existence with the coronation of Charlemagne by the Pope in 800. But there was a lot of confusion for a century and a half over who should have that title and what it meant to have it. Most modern historians consider that as a particularly German institution, the Holy Roman Empire began with the reign of Otto I, who was crowned King of Germany in 936, and Roman Emperor by the Pope in Rome in 962. Not that there wasn't also a lot of argument over the title later and what it meant. You should think of the Holy Roman Empire as more or less the German-speaking part of Central Europe, but many of the emperors made serious claims on large parts of Italy and the rest of Europe as well, and Frederick II belonged to the Hohenstaufen dynasty, which certainly did make such claims. Frederick himself spent far more of his life in Italy than in Germany. Here's a coin with his portrait on it, and it's clear from this, I think, that he took his claim to be Roman emperor very seriously. This could easily pass as a coin of some Caesar of the old pagan Roman Empire. Tradition says Frederick was born in the public square of Jese near Ancona because his Sicilian Norman mother, Constance, was over 40 and wanted there to be no doubt she had really given birth to him. His father, the Hohenstaufen Emperor Henry VI, son of the Crusader Frederick Barbarossa, died at just 32 when Frederick himself was only 2, and Constance died when he was 4, leaving him under the regency and care of the Pope Innocent III, whom you should remember as the friend of St. Francis. Innocent doubtless looked upon this as a great opportunity to raise the heir to the empire as a loyal son of the Church, but like many strong fathers, he was a total failure at molding his ward's character. Frederick turned out to be the most notorious atheist of the age. He was able to successfully claim Sicily through his mother, and with the help of Philip Augustus of France, he defeated his rival for the throne of Germany, Otto of Brunswick, the nephew of King John of England, at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214. The next year he was crowned King of Germany in the Cathedral of Aachen.
Natali regis gloriae letatur ceri curia.
On the occasion of this coronation, he is said to have put Charlemagne's, or somebody's, bones into the so-called Shrine of Charlemagne, which he'd had made for the occasion, and which is still on display in the Cathedral of Aachen. Innocent III died in 1216, before Frederick's battles with the Church had begun, and in fact in 1220 he vowed to go on a crusade. Pressing business of one sort or another kept him from actually leaving until 1228, however, by which time the obstreperous Gregory IX, Innocent III's nephew, had been elected, probably by cardinals hoping he would die soon and give one of them a chance at the age of 80-something. His exact age isn't known. In fact, though, he reigned for 14 years, and became, at probably something like 100, the oldest pope in the history of the Church. Unfortunately for Frederick, he got sick soon after sailing for Palestine and had to go back to Italy. Gregory, who had already become worried about being surrounded by Frederick's territory in Sicily and northern Italy, and probably hoped he would die gloriously in battle against the infidels, accused him of malingering and excommunicated him. This is a sword in the Vienna Art History Museum that belonged to Frederick. Excommunicate though he was, Frederick returned to his crusade, which presumption actually made Gregory even angrier. And he must have been absolutely apoplectic to hear that instead of using this sword to slay Muslims in the proper crusading Christian fashion, Frederick, who could speak Arabic, as well as half a dozen other languages, was getting along just fine with Malik al-Kamil, the Sultan of Egypt, who was then in Jerusalem. This is the same open-minded Saracen St. Francis is traditionally said to have visited in a politely received but unsuccessful attempt to convert him. Frederick and Malik signed a treaty to allow de facto Christian control of the city, with Muslims to keep the Dome of the Rock, and Malik went off to fight his Muslim enemies, and Frederick went off to fight his Christian ones. Jerusalem actually remained in Christian hands for some 15 years until taken by the Turks in 1244. This cape now in the Vienna Art History Museum was made for Frederick II's Norman grandfather Roger II, who was ruling Sicily at the time. And although it's embroidered with verses from the Koran, it was probably used at Frederick's own coronation in the Cathedral of Aachen. On his return to Italy, Frederick is said to have remarked that Palestine, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and so on were nice to visit, but that if he'd been God, he'd have had his son born in Naples. Which was, in fact, one of his favorite cities. He established the University of Naples, usually considered the first university to be established without ecclesiastical control, and supported, if he didn't in fact establish, the famous medical school at Salerno nearby. He was a very literate fellow, and Dante says that Italian poetry began at his court, with people like Rinaldo d'Aquino, the brother of St. Thomas Aquinas, who was himself at one time a lecturer in the University of Naples. Frederick's right-hand man was Piero della Vigne, who was the real inventor of the so-called Petrarchan sonnet stanza in 14 lines, ABBA, ABBA, CDC, CDC. This not very aquiline eagle in the New York Metropolitan Museum is thought to have once decorated Frederick's scepter. The Briton Michael Scott was one of the most interesting people at Frederick's court. He spent a good deal of time in Toledo in Spain and later in Italy translating Hebrew and Arabic versions of the Greek classics, especially the works of Aristotle. He was a famous astrologer and was still remembered for various presumed acts of wizardry long after his death. Frederick was also well acquainted with Leonardo Fibonacci, Leonardo of Pisa, who usually gets credit for definitively introducing the Arabic number system into Western Europe in his book Liber Abaci. This is a page from Fibonacci's Liber Abaci in the Florence National Library. You can make out primitive Arabic numbers at the upper right and part of the Fibonacci sequence at the bottom. The Fibonacci sequence involves adding a number to its predecessor. 0 plus 1 makes 1, 1 plus 1 makes 2, 2 plus 1 makes 3, 2 plus 3 makes 5, and so on. Without going into detail, if you construct a graph like this one made up of the sequence of these numbers, the squares, I should say, of these numbers, you get the Fibonacci spiral, which is remarkable in part because it is found frequently in natural phenomena. For example, Nautilus shells on a small scale to spiral galaxies on a large scale, and in many places where one wouldn't expect to find it. Properly dealt with, the Fibonacci numbers also give us the golden ratio in numerical form, 1.618, approximately 1.618 to 1. There isn't time to go farther into all this here, but that ratio is said to be found in the Great Pyramid, the Parthenon facade, figures that decorate the Cathedral of Chartres,
Leonardo da Vinci knew about it, and so on.
Another of his mathematical works, the Liber Quadratorum, was dedicated to Frederick himself. In music, he was also the patron of the man, generally considered to be the first great German musician and composer, and he has a memorable name, Walter von der Vogelweide, and he is usually classified as a Minnesinger, more or less the German equivalent to troubadour or trouvère. This is Nuremberg in Bavaria as it looks today, and though, as I said, the Emperor Frederick spent more time in Italy than in Germany, he made 8 recorded visits to Nuremberg, which you could regard as something like the capital of the empire in his day, although the capital, the center of government, was really wherever the emperor happened to be at the time. And you're hearing a song by his favorite songwriter, Walter von der Vogelweide, the first great name in the history of German music. This is his song called the Reichston. In Frederick's day, Nuremberg was proclaimed a free imperial city, meaning it was not under the control of any vassal and owed allegiance only to the emperor himself. We'll hear more about Nuremberg in its creative heyday when we get to Albrecht Dürer in the Northern Renaissance, beginning in the late 15th century. What seems to be one castle there on the hill is actually 3. The 2 large Sinwellen pagan towers, as they are called, belong to the Imperial Schloss castle. The pentagonal tower, probably the oldest surviving part of the whole place, was part of the next door castle that belonged to the Burgrave, who owned the land around the city and with whom the city itself was often at odds. And then at the far right, there's the so-called Lugensland Castle, which was built by the city itself. And the whole complex, though badly damaged in World War II, has now been completely restored. In this picture, you can see the pagan tower in the entrance to the imperial castle. Frederick may have been responsible for some work you can see here, but the 3 main towers were already here in some form before he was born. The chapel which you see now was also probably begun before Frederick's day, but work may still have been going on here during his reign. It is one of the few parts of the complex which was not damaged in the Allied bombing, and probably the most architecturally interesting part of the whole castle complex today. It has the round arches and the unribbed groin vault of the Romanesque style, but the proportions and general atmosphere of the place really strike most people as essentially Gothic in spirit. Since it was built about 1200, this sort of transitional quality is understandable. What's really unique about it is the large opening in the floor, which leads to a simpler lower chapel. The reason for this arrangement is still debated. The usual explanation given tourists, at least, is that the emperor and his associates attended service in the upper church, while lesser folk were relegated to the basement, from which, however, because of the opening, they could then follow what was going on above. I don't have any better solution to the hole in the floor problem. As important as Nuremberg was, however, the first real center of what was to become the German art form, music, was the Wartburg, 100 miles to the north in Saxony. It was here that the famous Sangerkrieg, or War of the Singers, took place in Frederick's day, and Walter von der Vogelweide was one of the participants, along with Wolfram von Eschenbach, the author of Parsifal, Heinrich von Ofterdingen, and Tannhäuser, whom Wagner, of course, made the hero of his opera very loosely based on the event. And, of course, he wrote another opera based on Wolfram's poem. And it was, in fact, Wolfram who won the contest. The most famous of Walter von der Vogelweide's songs is the Palestine Lied, or Crusader song in honor of Frederick's crusade, and we'll hear it now while we see a little bit more of the Wartburg. I usually play what are at least alleged to be reasonably authentic performances of early music, but we're going to hear a somewhat more updated version of this piece. It's become, in fact, very popular in Germany recently, and there are several performances of it by various groups on YouTube, which I guess underscores its enduring popularity and capacity to please a very different audience than that for which it was written. And of course, most great music does have that capacity. The oldest parts of the castle here were built around 1100, but it was much remodeled in later centuries, and a large part was rebuilt and redecorated in the 19th century. The most interesting part of the complex is the Landgrafenhaus, the residence of the Landgraves or Counts of Thuringia. The most famous of these are Hermann, in whose day the Sangerkrieg took place, and his son Ludwig, who married Elizabeth, who became a nun after Ludwig died on a crusade. In Tannhäuser, Elizabeth is Hermann's niece. This is the dining room there now. This is the Elizabeth room, but the mosaics illustrating her life were done in the early 1900s. So-called Festsaal or Festival Hall. It was built in Hermann's day, but again, all the decoration here is 19th and 20th century now. This is the Singers' Hall, where the contest is imagined to have taken place. This is a medieval harp on display at the Wartburg. Wolfram von Eschenbach was considered a harp virtuoso, but this instrument was probably not made until the 1400s. Apropos of the Wartburg is the cradle of German music. It should be noted that Bach was born just down the hill in the town of Eisenach, and of course Martin Luther, a musical fellow himself, made his translation of the Bible into German at the Wartburg, so we'll hear more about it again in connection with him in a few months. To return to Frederick II, this is the castle he built at Bari in southeastern Italy on the Adriatic. It's one of many such places which he built to help keep control of his Italian territory, and several of them survive to this day. Legend says Frederick and St. Francis met here in 1221 and talked about birds. One of Frederick's favorite pastimes was falconry, and he wrote a book on the subject, which is considered something of a classic. Francis is said to have at least persuaded Frederick to go so far in respect for his feathered brothers as to promise at least not to eat one on Christmas Day. The most famous of Frederick's buildings is Castel del Monte, also in the southeast and not far inland from Bari. This is in fact one of the few examples of 13th century secular architecture to get into art history books. And the usual view, among English-speaking art historians anyway, is that The only finer examples of medieval military architecture surviving are the slightly later castles like Conway, Carnarvon, and Beaumaris, which Edward I built in Wales. We'll see them when we get to the class on the Northern Renaissance. This is a giant hollow octagon with somewhat incongruously elegant Gothic windows and a sort of classical triumphal arch motif at the entrance. Above the entrance is the eastern window of the Emperor's suite, from which he could see the Adriatic some 20 miles away. Although it's usually considered a fortress, it may have functioned more in the manner of a hunting lodge where Frederick could practice with his peregrines. Inside, the courtyard reflects the octagonal form of the exterior. This is Frederick's recently restored castle in the town of Celano, east of Naples. The town here was the home in his day of Thomas of Celano, who wrote the first biography of St. Francis, as well as the famous hymn Dies Irae, Day of Wrath, which became part of the Requiem Mass text. We'll hear a bit of it in a minute. The high point of Frederick's reign was probably around 1230, but by 1240 he was having all sorts of trouble, not least with his own sons.
This is as good a place as any just to get a glimpse of the famous Palazzo Normanni in Palermo, which has parts surviving from the era of Saracen rule. From ground level now, as it stands, it's mostly the work of Frederick's grandfather, Roger II, and Frederick himself did spend considerable time here. This is the celebrated Palatine Chapel, which obviously owes a lot to Byzantine influence in this real cultural crossroads, which was Palermo at this time. Here's the Pantocrator in the east end up closer, very similar, of course, to the one we saw in Monreale just a few miles away.
Here's another coin portrait of Frederick. One of his sons revolted against him and then committed suicide, and another was captured by his enemies and died in prison. His former best friend and right-hand man, the poet Piero della Vigne, was accused of treason and also committed suicide in 1247. And finally, in 1250, Frederick himself died unexpectedly at the age of 56. Frederick was buried in this tomb in the Cathedral of Palermo among his Norman ancestors, wearing, after a lifetime of atheism and warfare against the papacy, the robes of a Cistercian monk. And you're hearing the Dies Irae of Thomas of Celano, the fellow I mentioned earlier from the Requiem Mass. I suppose that this was just an attempt to fool St. Peter, the Cistercian robes, but more than one atheist has lost his nerve on his deathbed. In any case, he left Sicily to his illegitimate son Manfred and the rest of his empire to his legitimate son Conrad, after whose early death in 1254 it passed to the latter's son, Frederick's grandson, known as Corradino. The period between the death of Frederick and the accession of Rudolf of Habsburg in 1273, a period of about a quarter of a century, is often called the Great Interregnum because it was a time of political chaos during which no would-be emperors were really able to establish central and anything like universal control of their territory and win anything like universal acknowledgement. In Italy, the French Pope Urban IV, fed up with the Hohenstaufens, Manfred and Corradino, asked Charles d'Anjou, Charles of Anjou, the brother of St. Louis IX, then King of France, to come help him. This is a portrait statue of Charles d'Anjou in the Capitoline Museum in Rome, and it's attributed to Arnolfo da Cambio, one of the most important sculptors and architects of the 13th century. We'll see quite a few more things attributed to him in the next couple of weeks. This work is sometimes considered the first real portrait statue since the fall of the Roman Empire. Charles arrived in 1265 and he killed Manfred at the Battle of Benevento. The very next year, 1266, and then he defeated Corradino at Tagliacozzo in 1268 and had him hanged in Naples. Donati, who was no friend of the papacy, put Manfred in purgatory instead of the inferno, though he has to wait a while at the gates because he died excommunicate. The end of the Hohenstaufen brood was delightful to Pope Urban, but the trouble was that Charles and his Angevins then proceeded to settle down in southern Italy and give him as much trouble as Manfred and Corradino had. The French cure was as bad as the Hohenstaufen disease. Before he came to Italy, Charles had had the fortress of Angers built in the capital of his Duchy of Anjou at the west end of the Loire Valley. He now had a similar place built in Naples by the same architect, Pierre d'Agincourt. It's called the Castel Nuovo, the New Castle. The giant projecting towers are the key features of both buildings. Some say that it was with the coming of the French into Italy at this time that the Gothic style was really given its impetus there, but that's a difficult thing to document. Several Italian churches in the Gothic style were already well underway by the mid-13th century before Charles arrived. Having killed Manfred, who had been the king of Sicily, Charles claimed that, as well as southern Italy. But in 1282, the French were driven off the island as a result of the so-called Sicilian Vespers insurrection, which began on Easter of that year, allegedly after a French soldier made an insulting remark to a Sicilian girl. This gave Verdi a subject for an opera, I Vespri Siciliani, which I always remember because the late Scott Beach once remarked that he went to see it, looked at his watch when the curtain went up at 8, and then after a couple of hours, as he thought, he looked at his watch again, and it said 8:15. The Spanish House of Aragon was the real beneficiary of the Vespers insurrection. Manfred's daughter, Constance, was married to Pedro III of Aragon, and though Charles vowed to sink the island in the Mediterranean, he never got it back from the Aragonese. And as we'll see, eventually the Spanish House of Aragon eventually took Naples away from the French as well. In the early 14th century, though, Naples, under Charles and his descendants, was a center of Italian culture, very cosmopolitan place. Adam de la Hall, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Giotto, Simone Martini, among others we'll hear about, all spent time there. More about politics eventually, but I mentioned earlier that no city was more important in the arts in Italy in the late Middle Ages than Pisa, and although Nicola Pisano was born in southern Italy and worked on various projects now mostly lost or difficult to document for Frederick II, his first great surviving work is the pulpit for the baptistry of the Cathedral of Pisa. It's clear at a glance that we're in an altogether different sculptural ballpark now from that occupied by Bonanno, Sant'Alami, and Willigelmo a couple of generations earlier. There's no doubt that this work represents a whole new degree of sheer technical impressiveness. No one who sees the Pisa baptistry pulpit thinks, I could have done that. Peter Murray, in fact, calls Nicola Pisano and his son Giovanni the creators of modern sculpture. Here's the panel which has the Nativity as its overall subject, with the Annunciation and Arrival of the Magi depicted at upper left and upper right. Nicola Pisano would have had plenty of opportunity in his youth in southern Italy, and while working for Frederick II, to see Roman sculpture, and it's always said that it had a heavy influence on it. The panels themselves resemble the style of Roman sarcophagi, and the Virgin herself reclines on a couch as though at a Roman banquet. Instead of the halo we're used to, she even wears the veil over her head, which was worn by Roman priests in the Vestal Virgins. Her attitude is regal and composed, and she looks here more like Juno or Minerva than the tender mother of the baby Jesus. Joseph, as the mere royal consort, sits at the left and tries to look dignified. This is the pulpit in the Cathedral of Pisa by Niccola's son Giovanni, who is regarded as an even greater artist by most. This is one of his later works, but it's convenient to see it right now in contrast to his father's work in the baptistry. At a distance, these two pulpits do look a lot alike, but Giovanni's style did become much more humane and emotionally intense than his father's. Before you forget what Niccola's version of the Nativity was like, here's his son Giovanni's from this pulpit in the Cathedral of Pisa. Although the Virgin still has a bit the Roman look, here she is clearly first and foremost an attentive, concerned, and happy mother. Joseph doesn't look so much dignified as just tired. It's tempting to suggest that we have here the first step toward the humanization of the Virgin and religious subjects generally, which will develop in the Renaissance. But in fact, this attitude is more exception than rule for a century and a half after this was done. In fact, the kind of intensity of emotion seen in the work of Giovanni Pisano is not commonly found in Italian Renaissance art at all. Renaissance artists, especially of the 15th century, will generally try to make their subjects as serene and emotionless as possible. In 1284, Pisa was defeated by Genoa in the Battle of Meloria Reef, and about 1/3 of the entire male population of the city was either killed or captured. Many fine things were done in Pisa after that date, including the pulpit we just saw, but Pisa's catastrophic defeat in that battle is usually considered to mark at least the beginning of the end of its real floriuit. And during the Renaissance, Pisa contributed little that gets into art history books. The Campo Santo here, though, the cemetery on the north side of the cathedral complex in Pisa, was begun in the 1270s, but not completed until well into the 14th century. The original architect was apparently one Giovanni de Simone, not Giovanni Pisano, but the latter likely had something to do with the ongoing project. It is certainly one of the finest such places in the world, and Edward Hutton calls it the most beautiful building in Italy, which is really saying something. In the 14th century, someone, perhaps Francesco Treni, frescoed the interior with the famous Triumph of Death pictures, which we'll see next week. Tradition says that Pisan visitors to the Holy Land brought back handfuls of holy ground, which were thrown in here so that the important citizens could be buried in the Holy Land, the Campo Santo, without ever leaving home. The finest work of Giovanni Pisano is said to be the pulpit which he made for the church of San Andrea in Pistoia near Florence. This is a 12th century church with a sculpture on the facade depicting the journey of the Magi, actually, which is signed by two fellows named Adeodatus and Gruamante, who were of the generation of Bononis and Willigelmo. There are a lot of stories, of course, about how casually the local citizens in Italy, and not just in Italy, can treat things which, were they in the United States, would be surrounded by velvet ropes and armed guards. Here's Giovanni's pulpit inside now. Once when I came here, the doors were locked, and I was told that the pulpit was in restauro, being restored. However, my informant, as shop owner and custodian of the greatest work of 13th century Italian sculpture, eventually agreed that since his nephew's son lived in San Francisco and was therefore virtually next door neighbor to me in Oakland, and because I expressed an interest in the very fine quality keychains in his shop, he would let me look at it through the back door. What I saw in the way of restoration going on was two men washing the pulpit with a garden hose. Not the sort of restoration one usually reads about in the Smithsonian Magazine or the National Geographic. Giovanni and Nicola Pisano are both usually classified as Gothic sculptors, more because of the dates of their work than anything else, but the arches here in the architecture of the pulpit are quite pointed, and in fact much more than in the Pisa baptistry pulpit of Giovanni's father Nicola. We're going to see this pulpit in a little more detail now and hear a lauda or laud. A lauda in the general sense is a non-liturgical hymn of praise, usually in honor of a saint or something holy. The one we're going to hear is in honor of the True Cross. These became popular in the 13th century in Italy and were especially encouraged by the Franciscans. Virtually all are anonymous. What you're seeing here now is one of the sibyls which decorate the pulpit. You'll probably remember them from last quarter. The sibyls, in short, were priestesses very highly regarded by the Romans, and the Tiburtine sibyl told Augustus, in a sort of pagan equivalent to the Annunciation, that the Savior of mankind would be born in his reign. And because of this, the sibyls are often depicted as something like the classical equivalent to the Old Testament prophet. This is the Nativity from this pulpit, which is very similar to the one on the pulpit Giovanni Pisano did for the Cathedral of Pisa we saw just a few minutes ago. This is the Adoration of the Magi now. And the Crucifixion. As I said earlier, this kind of overt emotion is not something that is really a feature of Renaissance art. It's more common in the art of the 13th century than that of the 15th. This now is the Cathedral of Siena. It was begun in the early 13th century, before the arrival of Charles of Anjou and any presumed French influence he might have been responsible for. We don't know the name of the original architect, but Giovanni Pisano was working here as a sculptor from around 1284 to 1300, and he was the architect of record in the 1290s. In the 14th century, Lorenzo Maitani, one of the architects of the Cathedral of Orvieto, which we'll see in a few minutes, and Francesco Talenti, one of the architects of the Cathedral of Florence, were also involved here. This is the church which I would be inclined to call the first Gothic one in Italy. The Italians, in fact, invented the word Gothic as a stylistic designation, and like quite a few such terms, Baroque and Impressionist come to mind, it was originally pejorative. It meant like the Goths, i.e. the barbarians, i.e. the French and Germans built. But in fact, no one would mistake this for a French or German Gothic church. The Italian Gothic is the most idiosyncratic of the major variations of the style, and even within Italy there are a lot of very different churches called Gothic. About all that many of them have in common is the pointed arch and the fact that they were built in what's now thought of as the Gothic period. Here's the facade of the Cathedral of Siena up closer. The Italian Gothic is usually said to be, to choose a few adjectives used by art historians, more vigorous, flamboyant, energetic, intricate, elegant, decorative, and colorful than the northern variants of the style. Color is one of the most important of these characteristics, I think. The typical Italian Gothic church is marble, or at least has a marble facade, often as here in various shades of white, black, gray, green, pink, yellow. This is in marked contrast to the more sober gray limestone of the typical French or English Gothic churches. The appearance of the facade makes it look sort of like a screen, a kind of false front on the building, and this is also typical of Italian Gothic churches. Giovanni Pisano did most of the important sculpture on the facade. The originals are now mostly in the Cathedral Museum and have been replaced on the facade by copies. Here's Isaiah, and in this, more than in his pulpit figures, there's a distinct foreshadowing of Donatello and Michelangelo. This is most obvious in the way the figure is twisted in its space. The head, the chest, the upper leg, and the foot all, as it were, point in different directions. This is very different from the hieratic frontal format of most medieval sculpture. The 13th century figures at Chartres are lifelike masterpieces, but only the very latest approach this degree of natural flexibility. Here's the campanile with the black and white marble striation that characterizes the church and quite a few other Italian churches as well. It's sometimes suggested that since the Sienese flag is half black and half white, this might account for such decoration, but as I say, a lot of non-Sienese churches use it also. And it's found in the earlier Middle Ages all over Northern Europe as well, this kind of alternation in colors, the kind of striped effect you see here. The campanile here is stuck onto the church in an un-Italian way, and the baptistry is also part of the main building, as though the idea were to combine all three in keeping with the presumed French model the architect might have had in mind. The black and white striation is carried right inside the church, producing an effect that is certainly very different from what one gets in the nave of a typical contemporary French church, although this photograph makes the interior look more garish than it does when one sees it live. Actually, the fact that Italian Gothic churches have much less glass than French ones tends to often make them seem gloomier inside despite all the color. Here's another view of the interior. The fact that round arches are still used here in combination with pointed ones suggests that the Italians were reluctant to give them up, and in fact, the pointed Gothic arch is not going to have nearly as long a lifespan in Italy as it will north of the Alps. In a way, it's as though the Italians never really liked the style and went back to the round arch as soon as they could. The inlaid marble floor here is not the least impressive part of the church, although floors rarely get much attention. No one asks who did the floor of the Sistine Chapel. The Cathedral of Siena even has a cupola of a sort that you won't find in any French Gothic church, certainly. And this has to make you think of the popularity this feature, the dome, will come to have in the 15th century in Italy. Nicola Pisano did the pulpit here, and there are many other things in the cathedral and its museum we'll be back to see in the future. Duccio's Maestà altarpiece, the Piccolomini Library, works of sculpture by Ghiberti and Donatello, Michelangelo and Bernini. This is one of the great Italian churches in the history of art. Now you see the Cathedral of Orvieto on its hilltop in the distance. Giovanni Pisano was also involved in this project, and later so were Lorenzo Maitani and the nominally Florentine architects Francesco Talenti and Arnolfo di Cambio. I. M. Godfrey, in his book on the history of Italian architecture, says the Cathedral of Siena is the greatest Italian Gothic church, but Orvieto is the most beautiful. And here's the facade now. And Maitani gets credit for most of this, although another 14th century Florentine, about whom we'll hear more later, Andrea Orcagna, is responsible for the rose window and the 52 heads of saints decorating it. And you can see the upper facade a little better now. Compare the round-arched arcade of full-length saints at the top with the ones just below on either side which have pointed arches. You might suppose that the round arches indicate that the top is Romanesque, but in fact it's Renaissance, and it's an illustration of what I said a moment ago about how by 1400 the Italians would give up the Gothic and no longer could stand anything with points on it. All the mosaic decoration of the facade is modern here, but the original work was similar in colorful effect, and all this color decoration, especially because it's mosaic, again distinguishes the Italian Gothic from the French, even though parts of French Gothic decoration were painted. As I said, Lorenzo Maitani is usually considered to have been the primary architect of the facade, and among the saved in the reliefs of the Last Judgment on the lower part is Maitani himself, depicted looking back at the church. And here's the interior now. The Cathedral of Orvieto has the same eye-catching black and white stripes we saw at Siena. The timber roof may look out of place in a Gothic church, but several important Italian examples have such a thing. Here as at Siena also, you see the use of the round arch the Italians found so hard to give up. The intricacy of the facade, which does have pointed arches over round ones, like the Cathedral of Siena, and then along with the date, which is always pretty much the thing most certain to indicate a style, these do all justify calling this Gothic, certainly. Now you see the former Abbey Church of Santa Croce in Florence, and when Bishop Monaldeschi of Orvieto became Bishop of Florence, he took Arnolfo da Cambio, who was working at the time on the Cathedral of Orvieto, with him, and the latter is thought to have begun Santa Croce in 1294. And after the break, we'll see it and hear then about the beginnings of Italian Renaissance painting.